Before the crowds followed him, before the religious leaders feared him, before the world understood who he truly was, Jesus began with a miracle no one expected. Existing far beyond the reach of our fragile, shifting world, we picture a silent observer, removed from the friction of our daily struggles. But the story of the divine does not begin in a palace or a temple of marble. It begins in the dirt. It begins in the ordinary, unpolished reality of a wedding feast in Cana. The transition is sudden. The narrative moves from the vast, silent expanse of the heavens down to the crowded, noisy streets of a small village. Here, the air is thick with the scent of roasted grain and the constant hum of celebration. Children weave through the legs of guests, and the golden light of the setting sun catches the linen curtains as they flutter in the breeze. This is not a place of abstract power. It is a place of human connection, of laughter, and of shared life. The Creator has arrived, not as a distant force, but as a guest among guests, walking the same earth, breathing the same air, and standing in the very dust of our history. The stage is set. The celebration is in motion. The feast is a tapestry of sound and light. Laughter rings against the stone walls, punctuated by the rhythmic clinking of clay cups and the low, steady murmur of conversation. The golden light of the late afternoon sun stretches across the floor, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the air. It is a moment of pure, unburdened joy. Yet, beneath the surface of this revelry, a quiet crisis begins to take root. A servant tilts a large, heavy vessel, expecting the weight of liquid, but finds only air. The hollow thud of the jar hitting the floor is lost in the noise of the crowd, but the look on his face is sharp with panic. He glances toward the tables, where the wine is nearly gone. The joy of the guests remains, but it is now fragile, resting on a foundation that is rapidly crumbling. The host does not yet know, but the silence of the empty jars is already speaking louder than the music. Shame is a silent guest, waiting in the shadows of the room, ready to crash the party the moment the last drop is poured. The transition from abundance to lack is silent, swift, and absolute. The panic is no longer contained to the servants. It ripples through the room, a subtle shift in the posture of the hosts as they realize the supply has vanished. The laughter continues, but it is brittle now, lacking the ease of the earlier hours. Mary stands near the edge of the activity, her eyes tracking the movements of the stewards as they dart between tables with empty hands. She sees the host's face, tight with the creeping dread of public failure. She turns to Jesus. He is standing near the wall, removed from the frantic pace of the room, his expression unreadable. She moves toward him, her steps measured, and leans in. "They have no wine," she whispers. The words are simple, yet they carry the weight of an entire social collapse. She is not asking for a drink. She is placing the broken reality of the feast directly into his path. Jesus does not flinch. He does not scan the room for a solution or mirror the urgency of those around him. He remains still, a fixed point in the rising tide of anxiety. He looks at the jars, then back at the crowd, his presence acting as a silent, steady anchor. The air in the room seems to hold its breath. Jesus points toward the stone vessels standing in the corner. They are intended for purification, cold and empty. He speaks, and his voice cuts through the ambient noise of the room with absolute clarity. "Fill the jars with water," he instructs. The servants exchange glances, their faces etched with confusion. They are expecting a miracle of some grand, visible display, yet he offers only the mundane. They move to the well, the rhythmic splashing of water echoing in the courtyard. They carry the heavy jars back, pouring until the water reaches the very brim. The surface is flat, clear, and utterly ordinary. Jesus nods once. "Draw some out now, and take it to the master of the feast." The head steward dips a cup into the vessel. He expects the clear, tasteless liquid he just watched them pour. He lifts the cup to his lips, and his eyes widen. The color has shifted. A deep, rich crimson swirls in the light. He tastes it, and the shock registers in the sudden stillness of his body. It is not water. The servants stand frozen, the vessel still dripping, as the scent of fine wine begins to replace the stale air of the room. The crisis of the feast dissolves. The light of the feast fades, replaced by the heavy, stagnant air of a small house in Capernaum. Here, the hum of celebration is replaced by the rhythmic, ragged sound of a child struggling for breath. A mat lies on the floor, the center of a world shrinking down to the rise and fall of a small chest. The mother sits beside it, her hands pressed against her own mouth, eyes fixed on the pale face of her son. Every second is a battle against the inevitable. Outside, the streets are indifferent, but inside, the silence is a weight. A man pushes through the doorway, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He stops, his gaze landing on the child. The father drops to his knees, and he grips the edge of the mat until his knuckles turn white. He scans the crowd until he finds Jesus. "My son is dying," he gasps. "Please, you must come before he is gone." The room holds its breath. The father waits for the movement, for the gathering of supplies, for the long walk back to the house. He has prepared himself for a journey, for a touch, for a ritual that would bind the healer to the dying boy. He watches Jesus, expecting the man to stand and lead the way through the crowded streets. Instead, Jesus remains still. He does not rise. He does not reach for a cloak. He simply looks at the man, his eyes steady and devoid of the urgency. The father's hands tremble, his fingers twitching with the need to pull Jesus toward the door. He opens his mouth to repeat the plea. Jesus speaks, and the sound is not a request or a prayer. It is a decree. "Go," he says. The word hangs in the air. "Your son will live." The father freezes. He had come for a presence, but he is being sent away with a promise. He looks at the doorway, then back at Jesus, the silence stretching between them like a bridge over an abyss. The father turns away from the room, his boots heavy against the stone floor. He steps out into the blinding midday sun, the heat radiating off the white walls of Capernaum. Every step toward home is a battle against the rising tide of doubt. He carries the promise like a fragile glass vessel, terrified that a single stumble might shatter it. The streets are crowded, but he moves through them as if he is alone in a void. He passes the marketplace, the smell of salted fish and dry earth filling his lungs, but he notices nothing. His mind is anchored to the house he left behind. He stops at a crossroad, his hand gripping the rough stone of a wall until the grit bites into his skin. He wonders if he should have pushed harder, if he should have demanded a physical presence. The silence of the road is deafening. It offers no proof, no sign, only the relentless ticking of time. He begins to run, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He rounds the final corner. The father stops dead in the middle of the street. The servants collide with him, their hands grabbing his shoulders, their breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. He stares at them, the words echoing in his mind, refusing to settle. He pushes past them, his stride lengthening into a run. He reaches his own door, his hand trembling as he grips the frame. He hesitates for a fraction of a second, the fear of finding only silence and cold stone holding him back. He pushes the door wide. The air inside is different. The heavy, stagnant smell of sickness has vanished, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of fresh water and open air. He crosses the threshold, his boots clicking sharply on the floor. There, on the mat, the boy sits upright. He is drinking from a cup, his eyes clear, the feverish pallor replaced by the flush of returning strength. The father drops to his knees, his hands gripping the edge of the mat. He touches the boy's arm, feeling the warmth of living skin under his fingers. The reality of it is absolute. The distance of miles had been nothing. The boy laughs, a sound that rings against the walls, and the father finally exhales, the weight of the impossible now resting firmly in his own home. The setting shifts from the quiet intimacy of a home to the rigid, vaulted stone of the local synagogue. Sunlight filters through high, narrow windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the rows of wooden benches. The air here is heavy, smelling of old parchment, incense, and the dry dust of centuries of tradition. Men sit in precise, orderly lines, their heads bowed in rhythmic, whispered prayer. The silence is absolute. Then, the rhythm breaks. A man in the center of the room stands abruptly, his movements jerky and unnatural. He lets out a sound that is not a human voice, a guttural, scraping rasp that echoes against the stone ceiling. The rows of men recoil, their feet scraping against the floor as they scramble backward. The orderly lines dissolve. The darkness of the human condition is no longer hidden. It stands in the center of the room, exposed and screaming. The man's body arches, his spine snapping taut like a bowstring. He screams again, a sound that tears through the fabric of the room, vibrating in the very marrow of those watching. The crowd does not just move. They surge toward the exits, their shoulders colliding, their breath coming in jagged, panicked gasps. They scramble over the wooden benches, desperate to put distance between themselves and the source of the noise. The man stands alone in the center of the aisle, his limbs twitching with a frantic, inhuman energy. He points a trembling finger toward the front of the room, his eyes rolled back, white and vacant. The air in the synagogue grows cold, the scent of incense replaced by a sharp, acrid smell that stings the nostrils. Amidst the stampede of feet and the frantic shouting of the elders, one figure remains unmoved. Jesus stands by the reading desk, his feet planted firmly on the stone floor. He does not flinch. He does not look toward the door. He turns his gaze directly toward the man, his expression unreadable, his posture a singular point of stillness in the swirling chaos. He takes a slow, deliberate step forward, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The spirit's cries grow louder, more desperate, as if sensing the encroaching boundary of a power it cannot overcome. Jesus stops inches from the man. The air between them vibrates with the force of the unseen conflict. The man's face contorts, his jaw locking as he attempts to scream, but no sound emerges. Jesus raises a hand, his palm open, and speaks a single sharp command that cuts through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. Be silent. Come out. The effect is instantaneous. The man's body goes rigid, then collapses forward as if the strings holding him upright have been severed. He hits the stone floor with a dull, heavy thud. For a heartbeat, there is total silence. The dust settles in the shafts of light. Then, the man draws a long, shuddering breath. He pushes himself up from the floor, his movements slow and deliberate. He looks around the room, his eyes clear, the frantic, vacant haze replaced by a steady, human focus. He stands, his legs firm, no longer twitching or constrained. The crowd remains frozen in their tracks. They stare at the man, then at Jesus, their mouths agape. Darkness is gone, leaving behind a silence of profound, unsettling shock. The heavy silence of the synagogue faded, replaced by the dry, rasping wind of the open road. Jesus walked under a relentless sun, the path ahead winding through hills of parched earth and scrub brush. The air here was different, thin, hot, and smelling of baked clay. As he rounded a bend, the atmosphere shifted. A group of travelers ahead stopped dead. They saw the figure approaching, recognized the signs of his condition, and immediately veered off the path, pulling their wraps over their noses and mouths. They did not look back. They left the road empty, save for one man. He stood in the center of the track, his movements jerky and uneven. He did not flee. Instead, he dropped to his knees, his weight sinking into the thick gray dust. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders hunched, his hands pressed flat against the grid of the road. The road stretched out, silent and baking under the midday heat. The crowd stood 50 paces back, their bodies angled away, eyes fixed on the gap between the teacher and the kneeling man. They waited for the inevitable, They expected the turn, the detour, the careful avoidance that defined the law of the land. It was a boundary etched in stone, a line that kept the clean from the broken. Jesus did not stop. He did not veer. He took a step forward, his sandals crunching against the dry, loose earth. The crowd shifted, a collective intake of breath rippling through them. Another step. The distance closed. The man on the ground did not look up. His posture AI braced for the rejection. Jesus moved into the space where no one else would tread. He stood directly over the man, casting a long, dark shadow across the dust. Jesus reached out, his arm extended, his fingers steady, moving toward the man's shoulder. The fingers made contact. There was no recoil, no flinch, only the firm, warm pressure of a hand resting on skin that had known only isolation. The man gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air that sounded like a sob. He looked up, his eyes widening as he felt the heat of the touch travel through him. "I am willing," Jesus said, his voice cutting through the wind. "Be clean." The words were not a request. They were an act of creation. Beneath the palm, the texture of the skin began to change. The gray, hardened layers softened, the color returning to a natural, healthy glow. The man's hands, once trembling and held low, began to steady. He pushed himself up from the dirt, his movements fluid and unburdened. He stood tall, the dust of the road falling away from his frame. The silence of the crowd was absolute. The boundary that had defined his existence for years had simply ceased to be. He looked at his own hands, then at the man standing before him, his face radiating a clarity that had been absent for a lifetime. The social order had been dismantled in a single heartbeat. The untouchable was now standing in the center of the path, whole, restored, and entirely free. Inside the house, the air was stagnant, heavy, with the heat of 100 bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Jesus stood in the center, his voice low and steady, weaving through the dense silence of the room. The scribes sat in the front row, their faces masks of rigid scrutiny, waiting for a slip in his words. Then, the rhythm of the room broke. A dull, rhythmic scraping sounded from above. It was faint at first, a vibration against the rafters. The crowd shifted, eyes darting toward the ceiling. The sound grew sharper, the splintering of wood and the dry crunch of clay tiles being pried loose. A scribe stood up, his brow furrowed in annoyance. But before he could speak, a massive chunk of the roof gave way. Sunlight pierced the dim interior, followed by a thick, swirling cloud of grit and debris that rained down upon the floor. The mat hit the floor with a heavy, final thud, stirring the settling dust into a fresh haze. The man lay there, his limbs motionless, his eyes darting between the faces of the crowd. Every eye in the room was fixed on his twisted frame, waiting for the demand for healing. Jesus looked down, but he did not look at the man's legs. He knelt, his gaze locking onto the man's eyes. "Son," he said, his voice steady and clear against the stifling heat. "Your sins are forgiven." The words hung in the air, unmoving. A scribe in the front row stiffened, his hand gripping the edge of his seat. A low, sharp intake of breath rippled through the religious leaders. Their posture shifted, shoulders squaring, jaws locking tight. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of their silent, bristling judgment. They leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Jesus did not acknowledge the wall of judgment. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the scribes, cutting through their silent accusations with the precision of a blade. He looked back at the man on the mat. The tension in the room reached a breaking point, a taut wire ready to snap. Jesus spoke, his voice ringing out, clear and absolute. "Get up, take your mat, go home." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The man stared, his breath hitching in his chest. Then, he moved. He pushed his palms against the floor, his muscles straining, and pulled his body upright. The crowd gasped as he found his footing, his legs steady for the first time in years. He reached down, gripped the edges of the mat that had been his prison, and hoisted it onto his shoulder. The scribes recoiled, their faces draining of color as they scrambled to clear a path. The man walked. He stepped over the threshold, his stride firm, his head held high. The house erupted. The echoes of the crowd faded, but the reality of what had occurred remained, hanging in the air like smoke. These were not merely isolated wonders or fleeting displays of power. They were signs, etched into the dust of human existence. They pointed to a singular, undeniable truth. The Creator had come near. He did not arrive to observe from a distance or to remain within the safety of the heavens. He stepped directly into the mess. He entered the empty jitters of a wedding feast, the suffocating rooms of the sick, the dark spirits of the tormented, and the social isolation of the leper. He moved into the paralyzed lives of the broken. This presence was not a static force to be managed by tradition or contained by boundaries. It was an invasive, restorative power. It pushed into every sick room and every dark corner, refusing to leave anything as it found it. Where there was lack, it brought abundance. The fabric of existence had been altered, pulled taut by a hand that reached into the dust to reshape what was shattered. The story does not end in the pages of history. It continues in the quiet, unlit corners of your own life. If the Creator turned water into wine and reached into the isolation of the leper, what does that mean for the empty, broken, or dark places you carry? These miracles are not relics of a distant past. They are open invitations. They call you to look at the dust of your own days, the failures, the sickness, the paralysis, and trust that the same authority is present right now. The Creator does not retreat from your reality. He steps into it. He is waiting in the places where you feel most depleted. He is the hand reaching into the mess, ready to reshape the shattered into something whole. You are not observing a story. You are living in the middle of one. Trust that the restoration is already underway. The dust is where the transformation begins.